Hello, everyone. I want to talk to you guys about really some of my thoughts about what's going on in the world. And this is pretty much what I always do when I do videos. I just talk about the whales and the travesties of the world and really disasters that could pop up in the future, or that, disasters that are more than likely going to pop up in the future. So here we go. Doom and gloom stuff. I am Mr. Doomer. This is a Doomer YouTube channel. I want to talk to you guys really about how the world is losing its mind. I wanted to say that the world has lost its mind, but they are still decent people in the world. They are still, good people. So I'm not going to say that the world has really just lost its mind, but I'm going to say that the world is currently losing its mind. Now, a lot of you guys are probably going to scream at the screen. I know that people do that because I do that sometimes. A lot of you are going to be saying, well, of course the world is losing its mind. I mean, just look at all of the crazy left-wingers. And I just want to say that, yes, the left is insane. Don't get me wrong. But really the right is also insane. The right is losing its mind, if it hasn't already. There are a lot of crazy righties out there, as all of you already know. And some of you guys watching this video are probably also crazy righties. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I'll give you guys an example of what I'm talking about. And then you can tell me if you fit this description, if you fit the profile of these types of people. In Israel, there is a broadcasting network known as Channel 14. If you go onto Twitter and type in Channel 14, you will get all of the insanity. And so if you want to see all of the insanity of Israeli society, just type in Channel 14. That's where you get all of these very far-right types coming in to express their rage, to express their violent desires, and they get pretty explicit. It gets pretty creepy. It's pretty damn creepy, to be honest with you guys, to be frank. It's just plain weird. You have these people coming onto this show saying things like, I love war crimes. And in my last video, I played some clips from Channel 14. So just go to my last video. You'll see the clips. But they talk about how much they love war crimes. They talk about how much they want to see destruction in Gaza. And they'll say things like, we should be killing tens of thousands of people every single day, that there shouldn't be a limit on how many people we can kill. And they just get elation. They have this feeling of utter elation upon seeing people being slaughtered, upon seeing people being butchered. And it's one thing to say, listen, I understand, war is tragedy. We have to kill the terrorists. Sometimes innocent people are going to die, but we really, really work not to kill innocent people. That's one thing. But it's entirely something else to come out and say, I love watching people being butchered. I love watching people being killed. I think we should be killing more people. Just keep killing and killing and killing and killing. And so this is Israel. This is what Israel is transforming into. This is the cancer that is spreading and metastasizing in Israeli society. And even Netanyahu knows this. Netanyahu obviously knows this. I mean, he's the prime minister of that country. He knows the culture very well. He has been in politics going all the way back to the 1990s. The guy is very familiar with his society. And he supports Channel 14. I did a video last night about how Netanyahu hates Channel 13. So there's Channel 13 and then there's Channel 14. Channel 13 is very liberal, critical of Netanyahu, and Channel 13 has played episodes showing investigative journalism exposing corruption within the Israeli government. And I talked about how Netanyahu told this multi-billionaire in Israel to purchase Channel 13 so as to change the politics of Channel 13 to make it less critical and probably ultimately not critical at all of the Netanyahu-dominated government, the Likud-dominated government. So Netanyahu is a crafty politician. He also wants to control the media to prevent criticism of himself and of his government, of his political party. But at the same time, Netanyahu is a crafty politician. You have people who come out and they'll say Netanyahu is like this crazy far-right guy, and I don't really see that. I see Netanyahu as a ruthlessly pragmatic and crafty politician. He's been around for a very long time. I remember going to a big Kufi event when I was in high school. Kufi is Christians United for Israel. It's this event that happens every year, and it used to be really big. Now it's not big at all because the trends are changing and people are becoming less and less enthusiastic for Israel. But I remember back in the day, this was back in 2006, 2007, when the American people were very, very pro-Israel and American Christians were extremely pro-Israel. And I remember going to this event and they had this giant screen on the wall and they showed this recorded presentation of Netanyahu saying, I want to thank John Hagee, who's the pastor of the church that organizes Kufi, that started Kufi. And he said, I want to thank Pastor John Hagee. I want to thank everyone at Cornerstone Church and all that stuff. And I mean, Netanyahu is very crafty. He works with the Christians. He pleases the Christians, kisses up to them. He gets that Christian evangelical support. And then on the other side, you have all these Jews who will vote for Netanyahu, but they hate Christians. So he's working with both sides. He'll work with the Christians because they revere Israel, and then he will work with these Christ-hating Jews because he has to work with them because he wants their votes, he wants their support. So he'll work with two sides that are extreme, but one side is obviously worse than the other. He'll work with one side, and then he'll work with the side that hates the side that he's working with. So it's a very crazy thing, but he's a very crafty politician. And he himself knows that he needs to contain the extremists in his own country. How do I know this? Well, I'll give you guys two examples that just come up right from the top of my memory. A number of years ago, the Likud, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, passed this law that would put people in prison for preaching Jesus in Israel. Now, Israel touts itself as a democracy. So in a democracy, you have the right to preach your religion. I can go right now and talk about Jesus to people in the public if I wanted to. I could go and say, hey, have you ever heard of Jesus? Do you want a card that has a prayer and has a number that you could call to talk to people about Jesus and all that stuff? I can have missionary work. I can legally set up a little speaking station in public, and I can have a little microphone, and I could preach Jesus to people. And people could get angry with me, but there is freedom of speech. There's freedom of speech. And so you have these people in Israel who want to control people's speech, especially when it comes to religion. And they want to pass laws to put people in prison for preaching Jesus because they don't want Jesus being taught in their country, even though Jesus was Jewish, even though Jesus was a rabbi, he read from the Torah, even though Jesus has gotten more Gentiles to read the Torah than any other rabbi in the history of mankind, even though it's because of Christianity that we have Gentiles focused on Israel, supporting Israel and all that stuff. They hate Christianity and they hate Jesus. And Netanyahu stepped in and said, no, I'm not going to allow this despotic law because I don't want this sort of despotism in my country. I don't want persecution against Christians in my country. This is what Netanyahu said. He said, under my watch, Christians will never be persecuted. He said this. Now, it's obvious that this is political. He doesn't want to anger the evangelicals, doesn't want to anger the U.S. government, because allowing such a law would anger the U.S. government, because the U.S. government doesn't want this country that it's been touting for decades as this amazing democracy to no longer be a democracy. And for a very long time, America has been saying that Israel is a place for all three of the Abrahamic religions. And so if Israel begins to persecute one of the Abrahamic religions, that will not look good for Israel. And in turn, it would not look good for the United States, because the United States is Israel's biggest ally. And if Israel starts acting like a co-Sharia, yes, pun intended, co-Sharia, like kosher and Sharia law put together, if Israel starts acting like a co-Sharia state, it's not going to look good for the United States. Understandably so. So Netanyahu is not this crazy fanatic. He is a rational, practical, ruthlessly practical politician. So what's happening in... Oh, I'll give you guys another example for this. I said I'll give you guys two examples. So here's a second example. Netanyahu does not want any sort of Jewish religious ritual to be done on the Temple Mount. You have these fanatics in Israel who want to go and do animal sacrifices on the Temple Mount. They want to do all sorts of, they want to do prayers on the Temple Mount. And Netanyahu has said, I'm going to maintain the status quo. We're going to keep the status quo. Now, if Netanyahu was this crazy fanatic, he would be supporting putting people in prison for preaching Jesus, and he would be supporting doing Jewish rituals on the Temple Mount. But he doesn't, because he has a status quo that he wants to maintain. He wants to maintain order. Because for Netanyahu, it's more about keeping power and maintaining order than it is actually becoming a full-out fanatical government. So Israel is not completely insane. It hasn't gone completely into the Masada mindset of antiquity, but it's getting there. It's getting there. And I was showing my dad these videos from Channel 14, where you can see these Jewish ideologues saying, more bodies, more death, let's kill some more people. I love seeing Gazans being slaughtered. And my dad told me, he said, when I was growing up in the West Bank, because my dad's Palestinian, he grew up in the West Bank when it was under military occupation. My dad told me, he said, I used to watch Israeli television growing up and in Israel under the occupation. And he said, you never saw this sort of rhetoric. You never saw this way of talking. And he told me that Israeli soldiers were very friendly. And you didn't see these fanatic hilltop youth types walking around. You didn't see that in my dad's day. But now in Israel, in the West Bank, in the settlement territories, it is very common to see these people known as hilltop youth. Hilltop youth are fanatic Jews who want to purge all of the West Bank of Palestinians to make it completely Jewish. These are basically Jewish Nazis. I mean, that's what they are. They're racist, they're supremacists, they're very violent. They don't want Christians, they don't want Arabs, they don't want anyone who is not part of the Jewish fold on the land. They even have their own military unit in the IDF. It's known as the Netza, what's it called? The Netza Yehuda or something like that. And is it Netza Yehuda? Yeah, Netza Yehuda. Yeah, I was right. It's called the Netza Yehuda, which means the Eternal Army. Judah's Victory Battalion. That's what it means. So this military unit is deep within the West Bank. And it's the military unit for the ultra-Orthodox fanatics in Israel. And they're all over the West Bank. They're in the settlements. And they will commit violence on Palestinians because they want to push Palestinians out of the West Bank. And you have these hilltop youth types who are part of that movement, or they're part of that way of thinking, and they act very violently. And this way of thinking, this ideology is gaining more and more support within the country. So it's drastically changing. It's viciously changing. And so what's happening in the world is that we are returning back to history. So if you go back to Judea in antiquity, you had this sort of fanaticism. It was very rampant. In the time of Christ, it was very rampant. That's why he was murdered, because he was killed by these fanatics. And you see this way of thinking coming back. You see this way of thinking becoming more and more popular. We are returning to history. The world is losing its mind. The peace that we have been enjoying since the end of the Second World War, which has been going on for 75 plus years or so, is unprecedented in history. If you go to human history, you will see that it is just riddled with wars, nonstop violence. If you look at all the wars that have taken place in Europe, both in pre-Christian times and in post-Christian times, or in Christian medieval Europe, you will have enough war stories to write enough books to fill up an entire library. You could fill up an entire library on books with books on all of the wars that have taken place in Europe. But in this post-World War era, we haven't been seeing too much war. Nothing in comparison to what we had during World War II and before World War II. But that's changing, and it's quite obvious that it's been changing because we have right now a war going on in Europe, and we have a war taking place in the Middle East, in Gaza, and before that we had war in Syria. So this post-World War II era, this post-World War II peace is breaking down quickly. And fanaticism is becoming much more common. And we are returning to history. That is what's happening. The cycle that mankind was so accustomed to in history is returning. And the unprecedented peace that we have been enjoying, it's all going down. It's all crumbling down. And I know I'm being a doomer right now. I'm being a total doomer, but it's just the reality. It's the reality. And today I was reading about how in NATO there is talk about how it doesn't really matter who wins this presidential election. The United States, NATO in general, is going to be shifting its attention to the Indo-Pacific, really China. And that means more and more arming of the Japanese. That means more and more focus on the Japanese because the United States is going to be counting, and it's already counting on the Japanese, to be a proxy against the Chinese. And what that means is that because NATO is going to be shifting more and more of its focus onto the Indo-Pacific, they're going to be more reliant on the Europeans, really the Germans, and the Germans' European allies on dealing with the Russians. So the Germans are going to be increasing their military. And you see more and more militarism in Germany. And there is a line from this article that was published on Euractiv. I want to read to you guys this line because I find it to be very, very relevant. It says here, Europe would need to be prepared to bare its teeth and move combat-ready troops right up to the potential front line in response to Russian military movements. Europe, especially Germany, being combat-ready to face the Russians on a front line in a major conflict. What does this sound like? It doesn't take much. It shouldn't take that long to think about. It's very obvious what this looks like. World War I, World War II. Trench warfare, European soldiers in trenches with tanks, with artillery, rockets, air forces, the whole thing. We are returning back to the ways of both world wars. And the reason why I say both world wars is because, unlike World War II, Turkey is going to be involved in this future conflict with the Russians, just like in World War I. That's why I say it's going to be like the next World War is going to be like World War I and World War II combined. Because in World War II, Turkey was not involved. Turkey was a weak republic still recovering from World War I. But in World War I, Turkey was a major player. In fact, I've heard it argued that because Turkey entered the war, that is what made the conflict into a world war. Because by Turkey being involved now, you had North Africa, you had the Middle East. And so it made it into a world war as opposed to just being a European war. And so what is America doing? America supports Israel. Israel could kill so many people. America is still going to support Israel because, well, it's cultural, it's religious. There's a religious aspect to it. You have all of the Hagiites, you have all of these Christian Zionists. A lot of them are just loons who will kiss up to Israel and be sycophantic to the Israeli government no matter what atrocities Israel commits. And then you have the cultural aspect of it. Ever since the Second World War, America has really seen itself as somehow connected with Israel, as a protector of Israel because of World War II, because America saved the Jews. So there is this way of thinking that is dominant within. There's a big spider on my window. I'm looking at it right now. There is this view that's very dominant in American culture that America must be Israel's, basically must be Israel's keeper, like what Cain said. Am I my brother's keeper? So America has to be Israel's brother. And there's also a lot of pressure. There's a lot of money. AIPAC, you guys already know all this stuff. So Israel can be a fanatical state, and there's still going to be pressure within the United States to support Israel. What America is doing now is it's supporting a monster in the making. That's what America is doing right now. It's supporting a monster in the making because Israel is metastasizing into a monster. It's devolving into a monster, into a Frankenstein. And they are monsters that are growing up, that are developing. We see this right now in Europe, where militarism is becoming more and more favored, more popular. Military conscription and really the draft is it's an inevitability. I have difficulty saying certain words. I'm sorry, but it's just the draft and conscription is really an inevitability in Germany. And so European militarism is reviving. They're talking about being war ready. They're talking about increasing their troops, the numbers of their troops. They're also talking about how Germany needs to better its air defenses, better its air force. And that really goes in tandem with the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden, agreeing to unite all of their air forces. So they want to make a giant pan-European military force led by Germany, and that's how they want to fight Russia. In fact, they have no choice but to unite to fight the Russians because the Russians are a massive military force. The European Union, on the other hand, has over 500 million people, much more people than Russia does. So when you have that many people, that means you have many able-bodied men who can be put into the battlefield. So Russia is also facing a big, big potential enemy, a major, major enemy, because with over 500 million people, you can amass a military force of literally tens of millions if you have to. So Russia is going to be fighting a very, very fierce enemy. It's not going to be easy. So you have the German military, plus you have all the Scandinavian air forces, plus you have all the other able-bodied men who can be drafted from all of these European countries, the Baltic states, etc. Plus you have Turkey. And Turkey is a country that historically has been an enemy of Russia. It has fought numerous wars with the Russians back in history. Many wars with the Russians. It lost all of them. So there's definitely bad blood between the countries, a lot of animosity there, a lot of historic animosity. And the Turks are becoming more and more fanatical, and the Americans know this, but the Americans don't care because the Americans need Turkey to be NATO's proxy in the Mediterranean. So there's going to be a war between the Russians and the Turks. NATO will be okay with that because they'll say, well, we have our guy Turkey, and it's there fighting in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is very important for us geopolitically, so who cares? So it's not going to matter to the Americans how fanatical or how tyrannical and violent Turkey is because America needs Turkey to be right there in the Mediterranean. Same thing goes with Europe. Europe can become a giant military powerhouse, and the Americans will be okay with it because they need that European powerhouse to fight the Russians in Europe. Bottom line. And then you have Israel, another country that is a monster in the making. It's becoming more and more like its ancient ancestors in the era of Masada and in the era of Bar Kokhba. who was a fanatic who fought against the Romans. I was about to say the Russians, but fought against the Romans and lost. And you had that rabbi who the Jews still revere, Rabbi Akiba, who said Bar Kokhba is the Messiah. And Rabbi Akiba was one of the sages for the Jews, and he said Bar Kokhba was the Messiah, and he was wrong. So why do you trust these anti-Christian rabbis? I don't know. But that's beside the point. The point is that you have these monsters in the making, and America is allowing them to form. You also have Japan. Remember what I said. America is going to be focusing more and more on the Indo-Pacific, which means focusing more and more on helping the Japanese. And the Japanese are very nationalistic. They will deny atrocities that they committed during World War II against the Chinese, against the Koreans. The Japanese did horrendous atrocities during World War II. Just look up the massacre of Nanking, look up comfort women, how they forced so many Korean and Chinese women to be sex slaves. Pretty horrific stuff. And there are so many Japanese politicians, and Shinzo Abe was one of them, who denied that Japan committed atrocities. So they have a culture in Japan that's similar to that of Turkey, where people deny the Armenian genocide. So you have these cultures that deny the genocides that they committed, which means that they wouldn't mind repeating them. Because to deny history or to manipulate the reality of history is really an attempt to get people to follow the very demons that the people in the past followed when they committed those very atrocities. And so you have these monsters in the making. Japan with its militarism, Turkey with its militarism, the Europeans with their militarism, Israel with its fanaticism. And in the future, these monsters are going to commit horrendous atrocities. And America will say nothing because they're going to say, well, those are our monsters. And we got a sample of this. We got a sample of this already. We got a sample of this in 2020 during the Nagorno-Karabakh war between the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis. Azerbaijan is an ally with NATO. It's also an ally of Israel, and both NATO and Israel support Azerbaijan. And during the battle over Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020, the Azeris were committing horrendous war crimes, beheadings, executions. They did it. And the world really didn't say anything about it. Well, it didn't say much. There were some people talking about it, but not a lot. And definitely not enough. Mainstream media wasn't talking a lot about it. Why? Because those are our guys. That's our monster. And really, it was Turkey that got that victory over the Armenians, because Turkey uses the Azeris as its bulldog, as its proxy in the region, because Turkey wants to control Azerbaijan, because by having control over Azerbaijan, it has control over Baku, which is right on the Caspian Sea. By having access into the Caspian Sea, it has direct access into Central Asia, which Turkey wants to embed into its sphere of influence, because Turkey has this aspiration of controlling the Turkic countries, and most of the Turkic world exists in Central Asia. So you have all that. You have that entire geopolitical ambition that Turkey envisages. So there's that. There's that monster. But America didn't care that Azerbaijan was committing war crimes. Israel didn't care that Azerbaijan was committing war crimes. Why? Because that's our monster. So we got a sample of that. And those war crimes didn't happen in the year 1920. They didn't happen in the year 1913. It was 2020 that these war crimes took place. And that was our sample. We got a sample of that. We got another sample going on right now in Gaza, in which you have war crimes being done. Let's be real here. Israel will drop these 1-ton bombs to kill one terrorist or a few terrorists, and these 1-ton bombs have this radius of destruction that can kill people like 48 soccer fields away. So it has these bombs have this huge radius of destruction. And Israel will drop these bombs. I mean, when America and its coalition was bombing ISIS, they didn't use this type of weaponry. And It's just horrendous. And you have this Netanyahu guy speaking in Congress, and he gets this 5-minute standing ovation as if he's talking in some Kufi Christian evangelical church service. It's sickening. But these are the monsters that we're making, and we don't care. So what's eventually going to happen? Eventually, what's going to happen is that these monsters, not all of them, but I think some of these monsters are going to go rogue. I think eventually Turkey is going to become so powerful within its own sphere that it's going to say, hey, we can kill the Jews. Because let's not forget, Turkey doesn't like Israel. They may have relations, they may have commercial deals, but they don't like Israel. I mean, at one point in time, Mein Kampf was a #1 bestseller in Turkey. So let's be real here. So I think eventually what's going to happen is Turkey is going to say, well, let's devastate the Israelis. And if the Turks decide to do that, the Americans are going to say, oh, Turkey, don't do this, Turkey. And Turkey's going to say, well, do you want me in the Mediterranean or not? Do you want my support against the Russians in the Mediterranean or not? Oh, well, and then America's going to have to make that choice. Is it going to split with the Turks, or is it just going to maintain an alliance with the Turks in order to have that foothold in the Mediterranean? These monsters will go out of hand. They're going to get out of hand. And NATO is going to be in a position where it can't break ties with these monsters because it's going to need them to fight against the Russians. It reminds me of Japan. It reminds me of how really the monster of Japan in World War II was a Frankenstein that was created thanks greatly to the Americans. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you see, let's go back in history a little bit here. 1860s, around that time, I want to say, there was the first Sino-Japanese War, the first war between the Japanese. I don't think it was 1860s, but it was sometime in the 1800s. First Sino-Japanese War. What year was this? I got to look it up real quick. 1890s, my mistake. So, how did the first Sino-Japanese War break out? Well, what happened was Korea. That's what happened. It was really fought over Korea. Korea at that time was not like today. It wasn't North and South. It was actually under a king who was an ally to the United States. And what happened was Korea was split between people who were pro-Japan and people who were pro-China. One day there was this pro-Japanese coup that broke out, and the Chinese saw that and they said, let's go into Korea and let's squash this pro-Japan coup. So they went into Korea and they crushed it. Much like how in 2014 in Ukraine, there was this pro-NATO coup that happened in Ukraine, and the Russians eventually said, we got to go in there and crush this pro-NATO movement. So the Chinese go into Korea, they crush the pro-Japan coup, and then there was this movement in Korea that was very, very pro-China, and the Japanese saw the Chinese really, really having a foothold in that country, so the Japanese said, well, we can't afford the Chinese to have control over Korea, so the Japanese invaded Korea, and then there was a war between the Chinese and the Japanese over Korea. Eventually, the Japanese defeated the Chinese. They routed the Chinese in the Liaodong Peninsula in China. And eventually the French, Germans, and the Russians forced the Japanese out of the Liaodong Peninsula. The Japanese said, we can't really defeat this force of 3 countries, so they just acquiesced and they left, right? They bounced. They got out of there. Eventually, the Japanese, they assassinated the Queen of Korea. Her name was Queen Min. They assassinated her, and then the King of Korea fled to the refuge of the Russians. There was I want to say a Russian delegation or something like that, and the king got refuge with the Russians. And the Russians went into the Liaodong Peninsula, and they built this fortress there called the fort of Port Arthur, and then they put a giant naval fleet there. So eventually, fast forward to 1904, the Japanese said, we got to defeat the Russians because they are our biggest competitor for power in Asia. And the Japanese did a surprise attack on the Russians in Port Arthur. And that's what commenced what is known as the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. Eventually, there was this horrendous battle that took place called the Battle of Mukden, in which the Russians suffered 90,000 casualties. Well, the Americans were so impressed by how the Japanese were defeating the Russians that the Americans allowed for the Japanese to take over Korea. And before this, what enabled the Japanese to be such a military strength, a military force? Well, the Americans in the 19th century forced the Japanese to industrialize. And because the Americans wanted to force the Japanese to be a trade partner with the Americans. So the Japanese acquiesced and they industrialized. They absorbed Western industry, and that led them to become militarily up to date. The Koreans were not militarily up to date, nor were they industrially up to date. So the Japanese, with their Darwinistic way of thinking, said, well, the Koreans haven't adapted, which means they have forfeited their right to be independent, which means we have a right to invade Korea. So by the Americans forcing the Japanese to industrialize and to, in turn, militarize, the Americans really created the monster of Japan, the monster that it would later have to face in World War II. The Americans are creating monsters. They're creating monsters. And these monsters are eventually going to fully materialize, and they're going to just go out of hand. They're going to get out of hand, and they're going to become monstrous. And the Americans will say yes, because America will say we need these monsters to control and to defeat the Russians. Anyway, the world is losing its mind. And I fear the day when the demons will be unleashed from the fetters that have been imposed upon them by God, and they will do a mass possession of much of humanity. And by then, the world really will just have lost its mind. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.